بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نويت التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير ابتغاء وجه الله مرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. Alhamdulillah. We are now in the phase of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam once he has done the hijrah and his move to Medina, and we spoke about him building the masjid in Medina and also creating brotherhood and sisterhood amongst his community and drawing up an agreement with the other tribes and amongst the Muslims and the non-Muslims, and also amongst the Muslims themselves. So now we come to in the second year after Hijri, where the Prophet ﷺ, Allah grants him permission for defensive warfare, where prior to this the Muslims were not allowed to take up arms against those that were attacking them and terrorizing them and persecuting them. And so now Allah grants permission to the Prophet ﷺ. And so the first expedition that he goes on ﷺ was the battle of Wadan, in which the Prophet ﷺ, he went to fight the Quraysh and the Banu Hamza. And it was to fight the Banu Hamza, but when the Prophet ﷺ arrived there, the Banu Hamza made an agreement and made peace with the Prophet ﷺ, so no fighting took place. So then we see that the next battle that takes place is the Battle of Badr, and this is where as the permission was granted for the Muslims to fight back, the Prophet ﷺ had heard that the caravan carrying goods of the Quraysh and some of the Muslims' goods that were put on this caravan, because the Quraysh had sold the Muslims' goods that they had left behind in Mecca. And so Abu Sufyan was now returning from Syria with this caravan of carrying goods. And so the Prophet ﷺ told the Muslims that we will go and take back what belongs to us. So we will attack this caravan in return for the wealth of theirs that was taken. And so the Prophet ﷺ gathered the Muslims to come forward and to go out on this expedition. And initially some were hesitant, but many came forward, and even some youngsters came forward who the Prophet ﷺ turned away, such as Bara ibn Azib and Abdullah bin Umar, who were too young. So the Prophet ﷺ sent them back, that they were too young to go on this expedition. And in all, they say just over 300 Muslims came forward and set out for the battle. And they didn't initially set out to go and fight. They went out to go and take back their possessions that this caravan was carrying. And so they say it's just over 310. So some say 313, some say 314 Muslim men that went out. And when Abu Sufyan, he heard that the Muslims were coming out to attack the caravan, he sent forward a messenger to the Quraysh to go ahead and tell the Quraysh that this is what Muhammad is planning, and that you should send out an army to intercept and attack him sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and attack the Muslims and protect your wealth, because he's carrying all this wealth that belongs to the Meccans, and that all this is shared between all the tribes in Mecca, and that if it's taken they would have huge losses. And so all the tribes in Mecca came forward, and each one of them were ready and prepared to go out to go and fight. And this was an opportunity for them to go and kill the Muslims, and they were looking for an excuse, and this gave them an excuse. And so they put together a huge army of 1,000 men, compared to the Prophet ﷺ, who only had 313. Here we had the Quraysh had just over 1,000 or around 1,000 men. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he sets out on the 12th of Ramadan, in the month of Ramadan, he sets out from Medina with this 314 men. And with them they had 70 camels and 2 horses. And so they had to share their rides, so 70 camels between just over 300. we do the math, that's over 4 people to a camel, and then he had 2 horses with them, so you had 3 or 4 people sharing a ride. And the Prophet ﷺ, he himself, he didn't just jump onto a horse or a camel and everybody else, some of them had to walk. No, he shared himself ﷺ, and he shared with Sayyidina Ali and Mirthad bin Abi Mirthad radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And so the Prophet ﷺ himself, he would walk at times while Ali rode, and then him and Ali would walk, and while Mirthad rode, and then the Prophet ﷺ would ride whilst Ali and Mirthad rode. So he didn't hold a position in terms of he was more, because he was a prophet, that he was more superior, that he had more rights over riding. No, he treated himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam exactly the same as everybody else from amongst his community sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So amongst them they only had 8 swords to go and fight. So between this 313 there was only 8 swords. And so because remember, part of the reason was they didn't have a lot of supplies, and that they weren't going out to fight, that they were going out to just intercept this caravan. And so the Quraysh, on the other hand, they had 200 horses and over 1,000 camels that they set out with. And how we know the Prophet ﷺ came to know of their number, because he sent forward when he heard that, so Abu Sufyan had sent a message to the Quraysh, they came out with this army. And so the Prophet ﷺ had sent spies ahead, and he had spies himself in Medina. So he received news that now the Quraysh are setting out to fight them. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he sends a spy to go and look at what is their number, how many, find out what is their number that they're in their camp. And so when the spies came back, they told them that they were slaughtering, they saw this many fires burning at night, and that they were slaughtering 10 camels a day, which meant that they had around 1,000 fighters there. So we know that they had over 1,000 camels, the Quraysh. So initially the Muslims, when the Prophet ﷺ set out from Medina, he had no idea about the Quraysh that they were setting out to fight him and to meet him. Because Abu Sufyan then, he himself took more precautions, that he began to take a different route back to Mecca, along the coast rather than the normal shorter route straight down into Mecca. So he tried to avoid the Prophet ﷺ, and so he sped up the caravan so that they go quicker, and he took a different route so that to avoid the Muslims. So now the Prophet ﷺ, he receives news that the Quraysh have set out with an army of 1,000, and with they have over 1,000 camels, 200 horses. So this huge army that's coming to fight them. And so the Prophet ﷺ wants reassurance from his Sahaba, his companions, that they're ready to fight, that he's ready to fight, but he wants to see, is the Sahaba, is his companions ready to fight, because that's what's going to happen. So he has a shura, he has a discussion with his companions, and Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq is from the first who gives his support, and then Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab, he gives his support to the Prophet ﷺ. And then one of the Ansar, Miqdad ibn Amr, he gives his support to the Prophet ﷺ. And so the Prophet, when Miqdad stands up and he says, Ya Rasul, we are ready to fight, we're here to support you, we believed in you, and we're ready to go wherever you are going to take us. And so the Prophet ﷺ wants to hear from some of the other companions that he knows Abu Bakr's prepared, he knows Umar's prepared, but he wants to hear from the other companions. And so then Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, he stands up, and he's an Ansari, one of the chiefs of the Ansars, and he stands up and he says, Ya Rasulullah, we've believed in you and placed our confidence in you, and we've seen the message you bring forth is the truth. We have promised to follow you and obey you with glad hearts, so go forward and carry out your intentions. And he says, I swear by the one who has sent you, if you were to walk as far as you went and plunge yourself into the sea, we would plunge ourselves into the sea behind you. Then you just go. And when the Prophet ﷺ hears this from Sayyidina Sa'd, he's overjoyed sallallahu alaihi wasallam that his Sahaba, his companions and the Ansar are ready to come out and fight, because he knew that Abu Bakr is ready and Umar is ready, but he needed to hear it from the Ansar that they were ready for this fight. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam now tells the Muslims to march on and that prepare for war. And so he tells them that Allah has promised me victory over the one of the two enemy parties. Either they'll receive the caravan or they will fight the Quraysh and they'll beat the Quraysh. So either way it will be a victory for the Muslims. And so the Prophet ﷺ at this moment, when he also can see the places where each enemy will perish, and when he arrives at Badr, he tells the companions at each place, he puts his hand down and he says, this is where so and so will be killed, this is where so and so will be killed, this is where so and so will be killed. And every place that he pointed out and he touched, they say that in those exact places that each one of those individuals fell and was killed. So now Abu Sufyan, he takes a different route, and when he takes a different route, he then finally realizes he's safe and he's close to Mecca, so there's no need for the Quraysh to come out and fight the Prophet ﷺ. So he sends a messenger to the Quraysh saying that there's no need for you to come out, I've saved the caravan, so there's no need for you to come out and fight. And the Quraysh are still adamant that they want to come out and fight, because this is an opportunity to attack and kill not only the Muslims but kill the Prophet ﷺ, and that now they have a real chance to do that with this huge army. So Abu Jahl, he insists that they will carry on marching up to Badr, and that he says that we will stay there 3 nights, even if there's no fighting. We'll march out, we'll stay there 3 nights, and we'll have this huge party. We'll slaughter camels. They have over 1,000 camels with them, so we'll slaughter these camels. We'll have huge feast every night. We'll drink wine and we'll listen to music. And so when the rest of the Arab tribes around Mecca, they hear of this, that the Quraysh came out with this huge force and they slaughtered so many camels, and that this was their spirit, they were in high spirits, that it will instill fear into these other tribes and no one will try to ever do anything like this again. And all these tribes will be left in awe of the Quraysh, and they will naturally show their support to the Quraysh. And so this is what Abu Jahl plans, but we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala plans differently. So the Muslims with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they arrive at Badr. Initially they camp at the well closest to Badr, and then one of the companions, Hubab ibn Mundhir, he says to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, have we stopped here, camped here because of revelation, or is it a strategy due to warfare? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says it's not revelation, it's just strategy. And so Hubab says, Ya Rasulullah, can I give an opinion? And the Prophet ﷺ says yes, and he says we should go to the well, camp at the well closest to the enemy, and that way and then the wells that are left in between, behind, that we will fill them up with sand, so that there's no water left in. And the well that we've camped next to, that's the only one that has water, and when we're fighting, us as Muslims will have water to drink, and the Quraysh will have no water to drink. And so the Prophet ﷺ agrees to this idea from Hubab, and they do such, and they go and camp next to the well that is closest to the enemies. And this is where then the Prophet ﷺ shows them exactly where each person will be killed, where each person will fall from the Quraysh. And so we see then the Quraysh army arrives, and the Muslims are camped and ready to fight. The Quraysh camp on the other side at Badr, and then the fighting begins on the 17th of Ramadan, which corresponds to a Friday night at that time. It was the 17th of Friday night on the 17th of Ramadan. And so the Prophet ﷺ on this night, he makes lots of dua. That he's standing there making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's calling Allah, that you can see the Quraysh army that's come out in disobedience to you, to fight against, they're fighting against you, fighting against the truth, fighting against your messenger, and they're fighting against those that believe in you. And so the Prophet ﷺ is standing calling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so Abu Bakr as-Siddiq walks in and he hears the Prophet ﷺ. And so he reassures the Prophet ﷺ, because he sees the Prophet ﷺ in this state, that he's beseeching his Lord, and he says, Ya Rasulullah, surely, he says, Allah will surely bring about that which He has promised you. Don't worry, Allah will bring forward that which he has promised you. So the Prophet ﷺ, he then makes this dua, Allahumma in tuhlik hadhihi al-asaba min ahli al-Islam la tu'bad fil ard. That, oh Allah, if this band of men, if this group of men from the people of Islam are killed, if they perish, destroyed, that you will not be worshipped on earth again. That if this is all that we have, these are all the Muslims here, and if these 313 or 314 men are killed, then you will not be worshipped on earth again. And so we see then the next morning, that morning, the 17th of Ramadan, the fighting begins. And the Prophet ﷺ, he divided his army into platoons, and you had a platoon of the Ansar that was led by Sayyidina Sa'ad bin Mu'adh, and a platoon led by the Muhajirin, who are those, so the Muhajirin are those who left Mecca and came to Medina, and the Ansar are those who gave support to those that were arriving in Medina. So they were Madani, they were from Medina themselves. And so the Ansar were led by Sayyidina Sa'ad bin Mu'adh, and the Muhajirin were led by Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajhu. And then he had a right wing and a left wing, and the right wing he had leading it was Zubayr bin Awam, who was on his horse. He owned a horse and he was on his horse. And on the left wing was Miqdad ibn Aswad. So you had on the right wing Zubayr bin Awam, and on the left Miqdad ibn Aswad. And the banner was held, the one who's representing, so the banner is important in any warfare, because the banner, when the banner drops, it shows that the army has dropped, and when it will drop the spirits of the Muslim army. So the one holding the banner was a high station. And so the Prophet ﷺ gave the banner to Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umair. And Sayyidina Mus'ab ibn Umair, we spoke about him previously. He's from the young men of Mecca, who was from the most wealthiest of families and had everything in the dunya, and he left all that. And he was the one the Prophet ﷺ sent to Medina to call the people, to teach the people of Medina. When they gave bay'ah to him, allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ, and Mus'ab, his calling, his da'wah, they say it had entered into every single house in Medina. And when the Madanis, when the Ansar came back to pledge their allegiance to the Prophet ﷺ, that Islam had entered into every single house. And so the Prophet ﷺ appoints Mus'ab bin Umair, because Mus'ab was loved by all. He was loved by the Muhajirin, and he was loved by the Ansar, and he was a symbol of Medina, and he was a symbol of Islam in Medina radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And so he held the banner. So now we see, before the actual battle begins, that the tradition was that you would have a duel between individuals, leading fighters from the tribes, from the armies. And so we have this duel that takes place where from the Muslims, Sayyidina Ali comes forward, Sayyidina Hamza and Ubaidah bin Harith bin Muttalib. These three come forward from the Muslims, and from the Quraysh is Walid ibn Utbah and Shayba ibn Rabi'ah and Utbah ibn Rabi'ah. So Shayba ibn Rabi'ah and his brother Utbah ibn Rabi'ah come forward, and Utbah's son Walid. They are the three that come forward. And so Walid bin Utbah is put up against Sayyidina Ali because he's young, and Sayyidina Ali, he's young as well. And so Walid and Utbah fight, and Sayyidina Ali kills him immediately. There's no fighting, literally no fighting takes place, that Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajhu kills him immediately. And Shayba ibn Rabi'ah, he fights Sayyidina Hamza, and the same happens. Sayyidina Hamza literally kills him within a few strikes, and there's hardly any fighting takes place. So immediately Sayyidina Hamza overcomes his opponent and kills him. Then we have Utbah ibn Rabi'ah, who is put up against Ubaidah bin Harith bin Muttalib radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, and Utbah strikes Ubaidah bin Harith, and Ubaidah bin Harith is injured. But when Sayyidina Ali and Sayyidina Hamza see they've killed their opponents, and they see that Ubaidah is injured, so they come to his aid, and they kill Utbah. And so Utbah ibn Rabi'ah is also killed, and Ubaidah survived initially in the battle, but he died from the wounds from that duel, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. So we see that in all three duels that the Muslims were already successful and victorious, and so this sent even more confidence running through the Muslim flanks. And so now the Prophet ﷺ, he begins to prepare his army for war, and he begins to line, and this is the general lining. We spoke about the Prophet ﷺ, he's an example for us in every walk of life, and this is him being an example to us as a military commander, as he's setting his army in terms, and his strategy, how he listens to others as well, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, listens to those that are around him and takes on that advice. And he was not arrogant whatsoever, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He listened to those that were around him and he took on that advice. And so now when he's straightening his army, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is holding an arrow, and there's one of the companions, Su'ad, that he was out of line to the Prophet sallallahu, and he was only wearing his izar, so his top was no shirt, Sayyidina Su'ad. And so the Prophet ﷺ pokes him with an arrow to move back into your line. And so he pokes him, and Sayyidina Su'ad, he goes, Ya Rasulullah, you were sent as a mercy, and you're harming me, you hurt me. And the Prophet ﷺ, look how he looks at and corrects himself and judges himself immediately. He says, you're right. He says that here's the arrow, and he lifts up his shirt, and Su'ad takes the arrow, and he says, the Prophet ﷺ lifts up his shirt and he says, take your revenge, take your qisas. And Sayyidina Su'ad, he drops the arrow and he hugs the Prophet ﷺ and puts his face against the body of the Prophet ﷺ, and he's there hugging with his face against the body of the Prophet ﷺ. And he says, the Prophet ﷺ is left amazed. He says, Su'ad, what made you do such a thing? Because the Prophet ﷺ thought he's taking his revenge. And he says, Ya Rasulullah, do you not see the army that's before us? Do you not see those men? He says that my shahada, martyrdom is before us, and that if I'm going to die, the last thing I want is for my body to touch yours, for my skin to touch your skin, Ya Rasulullah. That's all I want. And then he's ready, and Sayyidina Su'ad goes on to fight, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And during this time, they say that Shaitan, the devil, came to the Quraysh in the form of a man, Suraka, and he promised the Quraysh victory, and that they should fight hard, and that they will be given victory, and not to retreat. And when he saw the angels descend, that he fled and he ran away. And so we see the fighting begins, and the fighting is intense, and Allah promised His messenger victory and aid. So Allah sends the Prophet ﷺ 1,000 angels. We say Jibreel alayhi salam wearing a turban and riding on a beast, riding on a horse. And so he descends, Sayyidina Jibreel leading this army of angels, and the Prophet ﷺ described this to Sayyidina Abu Bakr. So now we see from amongst the Quraysh that most of the chiefs of the Quraysh were killed, and so from amongst them we have Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt. He was the one that choked the Prophet ﷺ, and he approved of the killing of the Prophet ﷺ, and he's one of those who threw the insides of a camel onto the back of the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ promised that he will be killed outside of Mecca. And when the call came for the Quraysh to go out and fight the Prophet ﷺ, this Uqba ibn Abi Mu'ayt, he was scared to go to war, because of the promise of the Prophet ﷺ that would be killed outside of Mecca. And so he was now concerned, and he was hesitant, he didn't want to go, and so he started to make excuses that he didn't have a camel. And so one of his companions gave him a camel who was a really fast camel, and said, look, this is one of the fastest camels in Mecca, that take this camel, because if anything happens to you, you can flee, just in case. So at the battle, when the battle started to take place, they say that his camel was the first to flee, but it forgot its rider, and it left him behind. So the camel fled, but Uqba was left behind, and he was captured and he was executed. He was one of two that were executed. Umayyah bin Khalaf, who was the owner of Sayyidina Bilal. Sayyidina Bilal was a slave. Umayyah bin Khalaf was his owner, and he was also killed. And he was killed by Sayyidina Bilal radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And Sayyidina Bilal chased him and caught up to him and took his revenge. He's the one that was torturing Sayyidina Bilal. And so we also see Abu Jahl is killed here, and Abu Jahl is killed by two young boys, Sayyidina Mu'adh and Mu'awwidh. So Mu'awwidh ibn Afra' and Mu'adh ibn Amr. And so these two young boys, they dealt Abu Jahl the killer blow, but he was finally finished off and killed by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, because he was in the last moments of his death, and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud came in and killed him. But they had injured him seriously, Sayyidina Mu'adh and Mu'awwidh. So Sayyidina Abdurrahman bin Auf, he says that I was standing in the line of the Muslim flanks, and he says I stood next to two young boys, and he mentions them as young boys. He says that they were in the line, and he says that he looks at one, calls him, he looks at one, he says, Ya Am, he says, oh my uncle, who's Abu Jahl? And Abdurrahman says, what does it concern you? He says, because I heard he used to curse and mock the Prophet ﷺ, so I'm going to kill him. And then the boy on the other side, so Mu'adh on one side and Mu'awwidh on the other side, he pulls Sayyidina Abdurrahman, he says, Ya Am, oh my uncle, who's this Abu Jahl? Point him out to me. And he says, what does it concern you? He says, because he used to mock and do this against the Prophet ﷺ, so I'm going to kill him. And so Sayyidina Abdurrahman, he says, then we see Abu Jahl walking across, and he says, oh boys, that's him over there. And so these two young boys, that's all they intend now, is to go and kill Abu Jahl. So these two boys, they fight intensely, trying to get to Abu Jahl, and one of them, Mu'adh, he was struck during the battle, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Sayyidina Mu'adh, and when he was struck, that his arm was hanging off, that he was hit so hard that his arm was cut off and he was hanging, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So when his arm was hanging off, and he's walking around still fighting, and he finally got fed up with his arm hanging off, so he put it under his foot and ripped it off. So he ripped his arm off his shoulder, because he didn't want to be carrying this arm around whilst he's fighting, and he ripped it off, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. So they finally come to Abu Jahl, and they both hit him a blow, each one of them, and they leave Abu Jahl on the ground to die. And so they come running to the Prophet ﷺ, and they both say, one saying, Mu'adh is saying, I killed Abu Jahl, and Mu'awwidh is saying, I killed Abu Jahl. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, let me see your swords, and he sees their sword. He says, well, you both killed Abu Jahl, that you were both those who killed him. So saying both of them, Mu'awwidh radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he was killed at the battle. So he carried on, he went on to fight, and he was killed, he was made shaheed. And Mu'adh lived on, and he took the spoils of war from and those that he had killed, and he lived up until the Khilafah of Sayyidina Uthman. And it mentions that, such as in the book Anwar al-Muhammadiyah, that his arm was brought to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ attached it back on and applied his saliva to his arm, and his arm was back to normal. This is from the miraculous nature of the Prophet ﷺ. And it also mentions that one of the companions, Uqasha bin Mihsan al-Asadi, that he was fighting with his sword until his sword broke. So the Prophet ﷺ gave him a small twig of a branch to go and fight. So the Prophet ﷺ gave him this small twig, and he said, go and fight. And so we look at this, where Ukasha, that he doesn't say anything to the Prophet ﷺ. What you give me? You give me a twig to go and fight. And he does it. He takes the twig and he runs at the army. Not for a second, reflecting and thinking or saying to the Prophet ﷺ, a twig. He just straight away runs, and as he's running, the twig turns into a sword, and he carries on to fight with that sword. And they say that sword was called Al-Awn, the helper. That's what the name was given to to that sword. And so we see that many things took place on this night and at this battle from the miraculous nature. So from amongst the Quraysh, 70 of the Quraysh chiefs were killed and 70 were captured. And they say Sayyidina Ali alone, so there were 70 Quraysh that were killed, chiefs that were killed, and 70 were captured. And Sayyidina Ali alone, he killed over 20. So at this battle, this is where Sayyidina Ali, karamallahu wajhu, he became known as a fierce warrior and a fighter. Amongst the Meccans already knew it somewhat, but even more so now. But the Ansar, that they had seen from this young man, Sayyidina Ali karamallahu wajhu, this bravery and this fierce fighter, may Allah be pleased with him. So he killed over 20 alone. And so all the corpses of the Quraysh were thrown into the Badr well. And the Prophet ﷺ stood over them and he said, "Oh so and so," and he's calling them by name. He says, "Are you pleased with the fact that you disobeyed Allah and His Messenger? And we've received what was promised, and you have received what you were promised. We've received what Allah promised us, victory, and you've received what you have." And so Sayyidina Umar, he says, "Ya Rasulullah, how can you speak to these spiritless bodies?" And the Prophet ﷺ says, "They can hear me as well as you can." And which proves to us that the dead can hear us, because these are those who are not even Muslim and they're dead, and if they can hear, then what does that say about those who are true believers and them hearing? So we know that the dead can hear. So from amongst the Muslims that were killed, there was 14 Muslims that were martyred in the battle, and we should mention their names inshallah. So we'll go through each one's name. It was Haritha bin Suraqa al-Khazraji, and Zi Shamalain ibn Abd al-Amr al-Muhajiri, so he's from Muhajirin, and Rafi ibn Mu'alla, he was Khazraji, and Sa'd ibn Khaythama, Awsi, Safwan ibn Wahab from Muhajirin, Aqil bin al-Bukair, Muhajirin, Ubaydah bin al-Harith, Muhajirin, Umayr bin al-Humam, Khazraji, Umayr bin Abi Waqas, Muhajirin, Auf bin al-Harith al-Khazraji, and Mubashir bin Abd al-Munzir al-Awsi, and Muawwidh bin al-Harith al-Khazraj, from those the two boys, and Mihja bin Salih al-Muhajiri, so Muhajirin, Yazid bin al-Harith al-Khazraji. So these were the 14 companions radiyallahu ta'ala anhum, may Allah be pleased with them, who gave their life at this great battle, the battle of Badr al-Kubra, the great battle of Badr, where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, as we mentioned, that if this band of men are killed, Ya Allah, that you will not be worshipped on earth again. So our religion and everything goes back to these 313 men and their sacrifices, and the sacrifice of the Prophet ﷺ. So the 17th of Ramadan is this Sunday night and Monday, which will be the anniversary of the Battle of Badr. والحمد لله رب العالمين. يا ربنا اعترفنا بأننا اقترفنا وأننا أسرفنا على لظى أشرفنا، فتوب علينا توبة تغسل كل هوبة، واستر لنا عوراتي وآمن رؤاتي، واغفر لوالدينا ربي ومولودين وأهلي والإخوان وسائر الخلان وكل ذي محبة أو جيرة وصحبة والمسلمين أجمع آمين. ربي اسمع فضلا وجود من لا باكتساب منا بالمصطفى رسولي، نحظى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي، نحظى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي، نحظى بكل سولي. وصلى وسلم ربي عليه أدى الهب وآله وصحبه إدادة الشهب، والحمد لله في البدء والتناهي. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. في كل لحظة أبدا عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزينة عرشه ومداد كلماته. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه. الفاتحة.